welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or where you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show and supporting the station. If you have any questions or comments about the show, send an email to comment@am950radio.com. So maybe some of you do the same thing that I do. I don't do it every July 4th because I teach it every semester at the college where I teach. But I took this year to look at the Declaration of Independence. So that's what this particular segment is going to be on to start the show here, because I think a lot of I saw some stuff online where other people were doing the same sort of thing, and this year July 4th I basically said, oh, what's there to celebrate, so I didn't do that. Plus I'm not a huge fireworks fan, so but I did read the Declaration of Independence, and I wanted to see how many of the grievances that the colonists had against the king and parliament at the time, how many the current regime is violating. So, taking what was done in 1776 and now using it in 2026. So, I took a look back, and I covered the Declaration on a previous show here, and in the middle part of it is mainly where the colonists listed and I did a count on them, 27 different grievances. At least they had 27 different paragraphs. Sometimes there were a couple in each of the paragraphs, but so I'm just using 27 as the count. And I went through it and I came up with 14. So a majority out of the 27 that the current regime, at least you could argue, you can make the same complaints against them as they did against King George and Parliament back in 1776. So let's go back to what I call the laundry list, and I'm going to go through those 14 here. So some on this list may not be specifically towards Trump, but it's certainly his regime or his government or the Republican fascists in office at the moment, and the way that they're running the country. So the first one I think is certainly happening today, which is, quote, he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, close quote. So basically what that says is the president is refusing to agree to the laws that are necessary for the public good. And this is certainly something that I've talked before about in here, and there's some numerous court cases that have come to the same conclusion, where Trump simply refuses to follow the laws and is fine breaking them. And he's done it over and over and over again. He's done it so much that I could probably do a whole segment on just this thing. But not only has he refused to follow numerous laws, he's also refused to follow numerous court orders, which is basically ordering him to follow the laws, or the judges are finding that he's violating the laws. And then he comes out and refuses to follow them, as he just recently did again. He has refused to follow congressional subpoenas. There was all kinds of laws broken with all those Doge firings. He's committed war crimes, as I've talked about. So he's violating international law here too, or when he's blowing up all of those drug boats that aren't really drug boats. And he's bombing civilians in Iran. I mean, he's doing it today. So again, this is Wednesday morning when I'm taping this, and we're back to bombing Iran now. Even though I thought that we had already bombed them to oblivion, but no. So, and finally, let's not forget the fact that this man is a 34-time convicted felon. So that's certainly another part of this where he's, broken all kinds of laws, and continues to do so. So that's just the first one. Second one is, quote, he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, close quote. So back in the day in 1776, England sent over royal governors, they were called, and these were the people who ruled over, on behalf of England, each of the colonies back then. So back then was the 13 colonies. So each of them had a royal governor, and that royal governor is basically what would be a governor today for a state. And this one is basically saying that the king and parliament would not let the royal governors, pass laws that would help out the colonists. So, back then, the king and the parliament interfered with, how the governors were, the royal governors were, governing the colonies. So, this is certainly going on today too, where Trump and the Republicans are, they're talking all the time about passing numerous federal laws, even though they claim to be states' rights, states' rights. Well, not when they're in power. So they're trying to pass federal laws to stop the states, which usually means blue states, from passing their own laws about certain subjects. So some recent examples would be like states trying to prohibit AI. They want some AI regulation. Well, the Trump administration wants to block it all, so they're talking about passing federal laws to block all states from regulating AI. Now, they haven't done that yet, but they're certainly talking about it. And this certainly relates to, data centers. That's going on in Minnesota, where there's many now of the towns and municipalities in the state of Minnesota want to stop data centers or at least do some more regulation on them. And the federal government is talking about, nope, you can't do that. And of course, the other one is, messing with our elections by Trump is demanding that they pass the SAVE Act, which basically turns elections into a federal government, right now, where they basically run the elections rather than what's plainly in the Constitution, which says that the states are supposed to run the elections. So this is another attempt of Trump basically telling governors and states that, we're going to pass our own laws about this stuff. And then all these, executive orders that he's been throwing around day after day after day, which are involving various topics that affect blue states in particular, and, trying to get them to do something or, saying, well, I'm not going to send you your money if you, don't do this. Those sorts of threats. So the next one is that, quote, he has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, close quote. So for this one in particular, involves statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Right, Washington, D.C. has been talking for a while about they want statehood. After all, they have more population just in Washington, D.C. than the population in Wyoming, and I think Vermont probably. Washington, D.C. may have more people than Vermont now. So at least two states. Washington, D.C. has more population, but they don't have any representation in Congress. So they've been asking for, statehood for a while, and so is Puerto Rico. It's a territory right now, but the administration is purposely deciding, well, no, we're not gonna deal with that. We don't want those people as part of the United States, as far as getting a state, because they know, of course, that they would probably the Democrats will get 4 more senators. And at least, a couple, if not more, House members. And another one would be holding up the signing of the housing bill that was passed recently on a bipartisan basis, by the way. And Trump says, nope, I'm not going to sign that one until you pass the SAVE Act. So he's basically screwing over all of America when it comes to housing there by saying, no, I'm not going to sign it until you do the SAVE Act. And by the way, he still, as far as I know, has not signed that bill. And with Congress in session, at least under the Constitution, he has 10 days to sign it. So we'll see if that happens or not, because I think that 10 days is coming up pretty soon. So continuing on, as this list keeps getting bigger and bigger. Next one is, quote, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. So back then they're talking about the colonies. For that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners and refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. So basically what that part means is the colonists wanted more immigration and more migration to the colonies, but the king and the parliament did not. So this is one of their grievances, is like, look, we need more foreigners here to become citizens, and to stop people from, and they were complaining that England was stopping people from coming here. Well, that's certainly something Trump and their Republican regime is doing today. Right? There's even talk of, and I think this has been done to some people, is taking away your citizenship. This administration has done that. So, let alone deporting hundreds of thousands of people, right? Breaking up families in the process, wrongly deporting citizens, right? Sending people to foreign prisons, all of those sorts of things that he's been doing, and this regime has been doing to immigrants would fit under this one that the colonists were complaining about. But yet Trump is doing it today. He's also he's obstructing the administration of justice. That's the next one. So this is another one where I could, probably do a show on it or a very long list on it, but I'm just going to highlight a few of them here. So again, being convicted of 34 felonies himself, likely being, if it weren't for Judge Cannon down in Florida in the Supreme Court, probably, he would be convicted of others for handling classified information. That case seemed pretty cut and dry. But that got swept under the carpet. And, of course, his Supreme Court has given him immunity now for during stuff that happens during the presidency. But he still has those 34 felony convictions. He's still contesting the 2020 elections. He's still going after his political enemies for that. He's violating free speech rights of protesters and other people, who criticize him or his administration. He's wrongly deporting people on purpose. I mean, there's been some cases about that where, they knew it was wrong. They did it anyway. All right. And this gets back to, again, knowingly violating court orders. And I'm sure he's got other classified documents hidden away already, let alone from his first term. And, of course, trying to steal the upcoming midterm elections. Right? They're doing all these things. They're going to try and steal it. Starting with all the gerrymandering that they started with. And, the current, his Supreme Court has rubber stamped that, but they're going to try all kinds of other things. You watch, to try and steal the upcoming midterms. So those certainly fit under obstructing the administration of justice. And kind of along those same lines, the next one is he has made judges dependent on his will alone. So I've talked numerous times on this show, and I'm going to do it later in the next segment probably, about how, this regime is appointing a lot of judges who are not qualified to be judges, who have never tried a case in their life in court. And the Republicans in the Senate are just going along with him and appointing these people who are obviously not experienced. But the reason that they're doing it is because they're all going to rule for Trump. And that's an expectation of all these people he nominates, is for them to rule in his favor on everything. And, the Supreme Court, for the most part, goes along with it, even though the lower court judges do not. But the Supreme Court is certainly doing that, and I'll talk about that later too. He has appointed a third of the justices on the Supreme Court, and they've given him immunity, right? So you can see how these justices are making political decisions favoring the regime and the Republican Party. They overturned abortion. They gave Trump immunity. They've killed, basically the rest of the Voting Rights Act off. Now, him and the Republicans, they don't win every case up there, but they sure win a lot more than the Democrats do. As I talked about that on a previous show. Right, and you got judges like Eileen Cannon in Florida doing his bidding. Right, and there's some other ones in Texas, right? So yeah, there's plenty of judges that he's appointing that are just doing what he wants them to do. Just like they were back in 1776. Next one is he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. Right, so this is like, how he's beefing up ICE and DHS, which is Department of Homeland Security, right, to harass us, invade us like happened to us over the winter, right, here in the cities. Right, and then he did Doge, right, that was a new thing, and they were gutting all kinds of jobs and agencies, and which, by the way, is going to result in the deaths of thousands of people, like getting rid of USAID. And increasing the budgets for ICE and DHS and, a huge expansion with that. And they're harassing and injuring people. And people are dying in their custody. Like, I think the number is I think it's probably close to 40 now that have died in their custody. Next one is, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Well, he was doing that with the National Guard in California and Chicago, and I think he even tried it here. And you got ICE agents, running around all the time in peacetime, acting like the military. And by the way, Trump talks all the time about calling out the military, right, against its own citizens. He's talking about doing that in Election Day, right? So, yeah, there might not be, the U.S. military might not be in staying in everybody's houses like back in 1776, but you can sure argue that there's standing armies out here without the consent of the legislatures, right? Without the consent of the states. He's been doing that. Next is for protecting the troops from punishment for any murders. That happened with Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Nothing's being done there. The DOJ is just ignoring those cases. They're refusing to investigate it, refusing to share information, they're refusing to do anything about those two murders. Another one is for cutting off trade with all parts of the world. So, that's certainly tariffs that he's done illegally, and that was one case where he ultimately lost in the Supreme Court, but, he did it. And he's still trying to do tariffs on various countries. And now, the Strait of Hormuz is basically closed again. And people are going to, if they want to get their ships through, are going to have to pay to get that through, right? And, pass that cost along to the consumers, right? He's like, There's a lot less trade going on in the world because of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Next one is for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Well, this again would be the tariffs. Remember, Congress did not pass these. This was just Trump just doing it by executive order. So I'm going to come back and do a few more after this break. So we'll kind of finish off that section here on Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch after the break. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matters show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch, so we're going to continue on with going through the Declaration of Independence to show you how Trump and the Republican regime are violating numerous parts of the Declaration of Independence. In other words, they're doing the same thing that the King George and Parliament was doing. So this next one is for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury. Now, maybe this is not like against, you and me and some other people directly, like they're not getting a trial by jury. But this is what he's been doing, as I've talked about on numerous shows previously, about how he's blowing up these fishermen in the boats, right? They're being deprived of not only their life, but they're not getting a trial, right? They're just getting killed. So these victims of the boat bombings, there's no trial for them, right? And a lot of these people who are being deported, they don't actually have a jury trial or even a trial in front of a judge. They have a hearing in front of an administrative law judge, an immigration judge. But, often a lot of those people don't have lawyers or anything. I mean, it's not really a trial, but let alone a trial by jury. But these people in the boats, sure, they're not getting their trials. Next one is, and I'm paraphrasing this one, abolishing our most valuable laws and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So the Supreme Court certainly is doing this. Ignoring precedent, changing laws on abortion and voting rights and, campaign finance, right? And I've talked about how the Supreme Court is taking away power from Congress and giving it to the president and to the court system, because this is what their political ideology is. They want to get rid of the administrative agencies, which, this last term I covered some of those cases. They're taking steps to do that. And replacing it with political hacks. So they are trying to fundamentally change the form of the government. And getting rid of some valuable laws. The Supreme Court just says, well, we're changing it. So the last one is, at least the last of the 14. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. So this relates back directly to January 6th. He excited domestic insurrections. A lot of those people went and did his bidding. And not surprisingly, he pardoned them all. Why? Well, because he was in on it. And then you have, on the 4th of July, you got white nationalist groups marching around Washington, D.C., too. These people, could end up being the domestic insurrectionists amongst us. And he's talking about having ICE and the military at polling places, violating people's rights. So that's 14 items from the Declaration of Independence that I think apply to Trump and the Republican fascist regime here. So what does this tell you about, our government? I mean, even the founders would have found this government unacceptable that we currently have. Despite, the Republicans' love for the founding fathers, they would not find this current regime acceptable. So The Republicans, they love to go to the part of the Declaration that says, well, if the government isn't working for the people, they can abolish it. Okay, well, they forget that there's a few words earlier. It says that people can alter the government too. So, once the Democrats get in power, if they get the House, the Senate, and the presidency again, let's hopefully they do that in 2028. But assuming they can do that, then it's time to start altering the government to make it work better for the common people in this country, like getting rid of the Electoral College, reforming the Supreme Court, public financing of elections, getting rid of corporate personhood and their ability to donate to politics, enlarge the House of Representatives numbers, right? Put term limits on Supreme Court justices and maybe even members of Congress. I mean, these are all ways you can alter our government for the better. But, none of that's going to happen unless the Democrats get to trifecta in 2028. All right, so that's the Declaration of Independence segment. So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Supreme Court in some of those. Well, I have talked about the shadow docket on this show a number of times, and I had asked a question a while back. Well, I suspect somebody's going to be doing some studies on how the shadow docket, is affecting the Supreme Court, this current one. So one has actually come out now. So the ProPublica has done an analysis of how much the Supreme Court used the shadow docket to decide cases in the previous year's term. So previous year, I'm meaning 2024 to 2025. So not the one that just ended, or, actually it doesn't technically end, but, they don't hear many cases over the summer. But so this is from the prior year to this year. So 2024, 2025. ProPublica looked at the Supreme Court cases, and they found that the Supreme Court, for the first time that they can find, as far back as our records go, that they looked, the Supreme Court now for the first time has decided more cases by secret ballot in the shadow docket than by following the regular court process. So this just backs up my, critique of the shadow docket and how it's allowing this particular Supreme Court to do stuff without having to justify their decisions. Right? Because the shadow docket is basically an emergency, right? They're supposed to find an emergency basis for doing stuff. And of course, there aren't in most of these cases, but the Supreme Court says otherwise. And these shadow docket cases are held without oral argument. They got very limited briefing schedule by for the lawyers, and the justices just decided, and they put out a paragraph or two without any reasoning or very little reasoning to support their decisions. Because they don't want to write any legal reasoning, because oftentimes the legal reasoning that they use doesn't exist, or they just make it up, or it gets rid of prior precedent that they're not following anymore. Right? So that's why a lot of these decisions from the Roberts Court are mainly rubber stamping what the regime wants. So as a result, these decisions have increased Trump's power and the court's power, as I've talked about before. So Congress is becoming weaker. And since Congress is becoming weaker, the people, the power of the people in a democracy is getting weaker as well. So this willingness to bypass a regular process has, that the Supreme Court is doing is, they've approved a bunch of policies that were often blocked in the lower courts, correctly in my view, with little or no explanation. And then they expected these judges to follow their decisions. And apparently the lower court judges have to have ESP to figure out what the Supreme Court's talking about here. And some of these emergency decisions have directly contradicted, long-standing legal precedent. Or they just make stuff up. So ProPublica found that 63 orders came under the shadow docket, where there were only 56 under the traditional process. of the, 119 cases that the court, put out some written opinion about. Again, this is the year 2024, 2025 term. So, of course, this is not going to help John Roberts when he's out there complaining and, we're not making political decisions. I don't know why you people think we are. Well, this is one reason why it sure looks like you are, John. This shadow docket, finding that ProPublica did just reinforces that the 6 mega justices are voting on their political preferences. So, and people are figuring this out. This is another blow to the Supreme Court's credibility or lack thereof. By the way, there's some recent polling on individual Supreme Court members, and a lot of them, their approval rating has dropped. So, that's no surprise, given what that court has been doing. Because typically these emergency petitions were on cases like, the death penalty, where, you need an emergency decision on those types of cases where, a real emergency existed. Or they did them on some procedural stuff, like people trying to get extensions of time to, do a brief or, do something else. So they petition the court on an emergency basis to see if they'll let them do that. And the Supreme Court, issues an opinion or an order on stuff like that. Well, that has changed. That's no longer what emergency petitions are in the mind of the John Roberts Court. So this started in 2016 when the Republican Supreme Court issued an emergency stay against President Obama's clean energy plan because big oil was getting so upset. They didn't want to follow this. So, Roberts said, well, we'll accept this emergency petition. Even though the liberal justices told him not to do it, other than there were a lot of legal, scholars and lawyers out there saying, don't do this type of thing, John. But he did it anyway, saying it would put too much of a burden on the energy industry if they had to follow, a regular process through the courts. So that by that decision in 2016, he's now really opened up a can of worms for his court. So ProPublica, looked at some of these numbers. So when Obama, he was president for 8 years, George W. Bush was president for 8 years. So that's 16 years between the two of them. They only filed, when you combine them, they only filed 8 petitions, emergency petitions during those 16 years. 8 is all. Trump filed 32 of them in 2025 alone. So in other words, in 1 year, he filed 32, while in 16 years, Bush and Obama only filed 8. So you can see what's going on here, right? And then the Roberts Court is accepting a lot of these Trump filings because he was losing in the lower court so much. And, by granting all of these emergency petitions, the Supreme Court is just letting him do more and more and more of it because they're letting him do it, which, again, shows you the favoritism by the Roberts Supreme Court towards the Republican ideology. Because the justices don't have to accept these emergency petitions. Just because they're emergency petitions doesn't mean they got to take them. They can just say, well, this isn't an emergency. And then you got, justices like Sam Alito coming out there saying, well, the parties are filing more petitions and, what can we do? Well, you don't have to accept them, Sam. You know this. You're just out there, playing games again, like you love to do. You could just say, well, there's no emergency here, and let go through the normal court process. But no, when you have a specific political decision you want to reach, that's when you start granting all of these emergency petitions so that you don't have to give any legal reasoning for why you're doing these things. So they did a bunch of this with these immigration cases where you greenlit more and more, and faster deportations. You didn't have to treat these as emergencies, but you did because that fits your political positions on this. And you did the same thing with the election cases, where you say, oh, yeah, you can gerrymander all you want. And guess which justice is allowing the most emergency cases? Because normally, depending on where you file these emergency petitions, the justice that covers that area across the country, they get the initial look at it and they make a decision, well, is this an emergency or not? Guess who's number one? John Roberts. So during that year that ProPublica looked at, he did almost half of them just by himself. So here again, he's doing these for political reasons, despite his claims to the contrary. And I've talked before about there were many lower court judges who have complained about this problem and how they're messing up their cases and there's no legal reasoning to follow once the case gets sent back to them, and they're like, what am I supposed to do here? Because they don't give any legal reasoning in their decisions. These trial court judges are the ones that have hearings or their trials, and they're issuing all these long decisions, sometimes, 100 pages or so. And the Supreme Court's just like, we don't like that conclusion, so we're just doing our paragraph here without any decisions. Right? And that's what they're doing with this shadow docket on purpose. And there's been a lot of retired federal judges and retired lawyers who have complained to the court about this process now, and there's no end in sight for it. So I'm sure ProPublica or somebody else is going to look at this current term when it is done in the end of September, because the new one starts in October. So would it surprise anybody, if this trend gets even worse? No. If John Roberts wants to rehabilitate the image of the court, he can make a good start without doing all these shadow docket cases. Right? Use the regular process, but he won't do it. Neither will Alito and Thomas, they like doing it this way. Then they don't have to justify their decisions. And they can make their political, policies into law. All the more reason, Democrats, if you take over, you got to start, number one thing is you got to start reforming the Supreme Court. All right, we're going to take our second break here. And when I come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about, still talk about the government here a little bit but I'm going to talk more about how Congress is, doing nothing and but losing power. So we're going to talk about some of the ways, this has been going on and maybe some ways to fix it. So we'll talk about that on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show, how civics, politics, and law affect you. Here on AM 950 Radio, the Burgers of the Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So, keeping with my theme of talking about, the government today, I want to talk about Congress. Right? So, remember that under our system, Congress means the House and the Senate together. Sometimes when people say Congress, they're just talking about the House. They're both of them. Right? That's in the Constitution. So, the reason that I'm kind of going through this segment here is because I've heard recently, again and again, that, we have three branches of government and they're co-equal branches of government. And I keep telling people, no, we don't have three co-equal branches of government. I mean, I know people like to think we're equal branches. They have equal power. They can, do this and that and try and, they got to cooperate to, make the government work. If you look in the Constitution, there's no mention of co-equal branches of government. As a matter of fact, as I'm going to argue here in this segment, the Founding Fathers expected Congress to be the most powerful of the three branches of government. There was no argument that, they have to be co-equal. No. That didn't happen. So, and it's a fascinating read if you go back and you read like Madison's notes during the convention, and there's been books done by various authors about what happened to the Constitutional Convention. So, you can go back and look at some of that stuff. The Founding Fathers did not set this up to be three co-equal branches of government. Basically, their view was Congress was number one. The president was going to be the second, and the courts were going to be the third. Hence, Article 1 is about Congress. Article 2 is about the presidency. Article 3 is about the courts. There's a reason they did it that way. So, I'm going to just here stick with Congress. Okay? Because again, the Founding Fathers thought that Congress is going to be the most powerful branch, which is why they split it into two different parts, which is why we have the House and the Senate. We don't just have one Congress, right? Or one legislature. I mean, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. They purposely split the power between them, gave each part different powers. We've talked about that before here. And Madison himself, he says this right in Federalist number 51, that the legislative branch is the strongest of the three branches. So if you look back in history to the 1770s and the 1780s, when the Declaration and the Constitution was written, right? You can also see why Congress is the strongest branch of the three. The United States had a revolution against the king and a system of monarchy and hereditary rule in England, and other places around the world for that matter. But, ours was specifically against England. We rebelled against that system and replaced it with one based on the consent of the people being governed by electing representatives to run the government for us, right? That's what the people in Congress are for. That's what the president is for, right? To represent us in this government. We did not make a government where, there was going to be a king or in our case, the president, despite what, Trump and his lackeys think. He's not a king. Okay. And Congress doesn't, the legislature doesn't have a system of monarchy and hereditary rule. Now, again, you can argue that, there's certainly the rich people have a lot of say in who gets elected in this country. But, back at the time, you can see why the Congress is the most powerful branch. So if you look at the Constitution itself, Article 1 is about Congress. That is by far the biggest article, by far. And they did that for a reason, because they thought it would have the most power, so they wrote a lot more about that branch. Plus, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, that is where there are 18 specific powers of Congress listed there. Which is the biggest part of any section in the Constitution, is about the powers of Congress, which again shows that they thought that was going to be the strongest branch. So those 18 specific powers is far more than you'll see in Article 2 on the president or Article 3 on the courts for the powers they have. Not even close to 18. Plus, Congress has the power to impeach the president or impeach a judge, a federal judge, or any other federal official. The president or the courts can't remove a congressperson. Congress can kick out a congressperson. So Congress has more power here, over the president or the judges. So it's not supposed to be co-equal. Congress can overturn a presidential veto. Again, more power to Congress, not to the president. Now, granted, getting 2/3 to, overturn a presidential veto is not an easy thing these days. Especially with the spineless Republicans in control of Congress. But, there's been overcoming a veto throughout our history. So Congress is given that power over the presidency. I personally think that the founders messed up a little bit with Article 3 on the federal courts because the Supreme Court now is basically deciding everything these days. And as I've argued before, they're taking power away from Congress and giving it to the president or to the courts. Now, if we had a Supreme Court that is, actually committed to the Constitution, we wouldn't be where we are today with these 6-3 mega Republican Supreme Courts doing the bidding of Trump and the regime. The Supreme Court wasn't always this way, but they are now, unfortunately. So, they have a lot more power than what the founders thought. And if you look again, this is the shortest section of the 3 in the Constitution. And again, if you read what the founding fathers talked about back in the day, they didn't think that the courts were going to be that powerful at all, actually. So if you forward to today, Congress is failing to use its power with the Republicans in control because of their fealty for Trump or their fear of Trump or, who knows. But they're just, actively on purpose not doing anything. They're just doing what Trump wants. So Congress didn't declare war on Iran, nor did Trump comply with the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which, doesn't allow the president to have unilateral military action, unless he's using it to repel an actual or imminent military attack on the United States, which we don't have. Even the United States intelligence, before we bombed Iran, said no. They're not, we're not going to be under an imminent military attack, and they don't have nuclear weapons anyway. But the Republican cowards in Congress are just letting them do it. So it's costing the United States billions of dollars. It's raising our prices. Inflation's going up. It's adding to our national debt, which the Republicans love to, we have too much debt. Well, they're adding to it. Right? We have dead military troops, thousands of dead people in Iran. Right, Congress is just giving him more power. They need to start taking it back. So, once the Democrats, have a chance, once they take Congress back, is they can start changing some of these things and put Congress back as the top branch of government. But they got to be willing to take on Trump and the Supreme Court. And so, again, this is why they got to do something about the Supreme Court when they get back into power. All right. Thanks for listening this week. We will talk to you next week here on the Politics Matter Show.